If you clicked on this video, you've probably seen this image. It's a screenshot from the recently released Final Fantasy VII Rebirth demo, in which everyone's second favorite Italian Senate member can be seen climbing some interestingly colored rocks. A tweet calling out the colorful cliffside did numbers and sparked the quote-unquote yellow paint discourse. That's discourse with a lowercase d because it's like 10% people engaging in level-headed discussion, and the other 90% are doing their best Tifa Lockhart impression. The yellow paint discourse is nothing new. It first started making waves last year with the Resident Evil 4 Remake, which marked many of its interactable items with that same color. Again, folks took to their platforms of choice to complain about the horrors of brightly colored paint on their video game assets. Gamers were furious. The game still went on to sell over 6 million copies, so I mean, they couldn't have been that mad. But people were still extremely outspoken about their distaste for the seemingly innocuous design decision. But why? What is it about this damn color that rustles everybody's jimmies? Before looking at the backlash, I think we should ask why these kinds of things even exist in the first place. Video games differ from other art forms in that they allow you to directly interact with the medium. The ability to progress through a game is entirely tied to the player's input. If you don't pick up on a movie's themes, that doesn't prevent you from watching it start to finish. But a game you're having trouble navigating grinds to a halt until you learn to speak its language. This makes it crucial for developers to find ways to effectively communicate to players what they can and can't do, where they can and can't go. See, the talk around painted environments and signposting is part of a larger discussion around hand-holding in modern video games, around the belief that, in their attempt to appeal to the widest demographic, game companies have dumbed things down and alienated their core audience. While there is a lot to be said about games that are overbearing with their assistance, I just can't bring myself to say that this is a particularly egregious example of that. Using a highly visible color to grab players' attention has been around for years, and its intended purpose wasn't a secret back then either. Yellow paint isn't a new occurrence, but bitching about it certainly is. There seems to be two main camps arguing against it. Those that dislike signposting entirely, and those that understand its importance, but think that yellow paint is a lazy and ham-fisted way to go about it. It doesn't mesh with the environment and breaks immersion. To address the latter group, let's look at some alternative approaches other games have taken. In the original Resident Evil 4, breakable crates were easily identifiable because of their unique lighting. Everything around them is lit how you would expect, but the crates themselves didn't get the memo. They give off a vibrant glow that makes it apparent that they don't quite belong. The item drops also violate the environmental lighting and glisten to make them stand out. The original Final Fantasy VII uses a bit of both methods for its chests. They not only glisten, but set themselves apart by being in-game 3D models, whereas non-interactable boxes exist as part of the pre-rendered backgrounds. I find it strange how RE4 Remake's approach was met with such vitriol, yet nobody seems to have that same energy for the original. In fact, I've even seen people suggest that the remake should have used a similar method, which is wild to me, because grabbing the player's attention by having items glow with the luminance of 1,000 suns seems antithetical to immersion. It worked so well in the original specifically because of how out of place the crates looked. It's like those scenes in anime where you have a 2D character fighting the worst CGI your eyes have ever seen, and you're just supposed to believe that these two exist in the same universe. This method would look markedly worse than any amount of paint. Imagine hopping on your new next-gen game with its fancy ray tracing, ambient occlusion and whatever, and a select few environmental items are just like,
nah, I'ma do my own thing.
Hey, you. You're finally awake.
There's no video game more difficult to visually parse than the game called real life. The more realistic visuals get, the less developers can rely on old methods of indirectly communicating with the player. What was simply attention-grabbing in 2005 would look downright incompatible in a modern hyper-realistic title. You can't just throw wooden crate sprite.png into a fully 3D world and call it a day. More has to be done to make sure that everything feels consistent with the environment. 4 Remake does achieve this as the paint is diegetic, meaning that unlike the original's glowing boxes, these barrels are actually marked with streaks of yellow in-universe. Which begs the question, why? I mean, it's obviously for the player, but in the context of this world, who's running around with a paint bucket? This is another issue unique to games that heavily lean on realistic graphics. Any aspect of game design that's done purely in service of the player is much easier to accept when it's not occurring in-universe. There's an understanding that UI elements like button prompts in your heads-up display exist separate from the game world. Some games go above and beyond and make even those things diegetic, but it's far from the norm. I ain't ever seen somebody complain about the lack of lore implications of a tutorial message, but when the guidance exists in the game world, it can potentially be jarring.
Sorry to hear that. I'm sending you a playing manual. Hope you find it useful.
Playing manual? Why would she say that? I'm fighting for my life out here. The marked items aren't something that's ever explained, but I find it hard to believe that people are angry simply because they can't reconcile paint not having a narrative explanation, when in the same game, we accept far more unrealistic things, like with the staple item of any shooter or action game, explosive barrels, which beyond just being bright red, exists solely in service of the player.
Hey bro, what's good? I just wanted to let you know I ordered like 50 explosive barrels and spread them throughout my evil lair where I be doing evil and shit. And I instructed my henchmen to stand as humanly close as possible to each barrel, so if you wanted to, I don't know, maybe shoot them and kill a bunch of goons at once so you can make your way through the island and thwart my plans, that would be awful. Like, I would really hate that.
Guess I'm supposed to thank you, right?
I'm just not buying the argument that something like this significantly impacts immersion. In a 2011 blog post, a developer on the game Bulletstorm details their decision to make the game's exploding red barrels, well, red. It wasn't for a lack of imagination. The barrels were originally green, but players just didn't think to shoot them until they went back and redesigned them to be more in line with that iconic red cylinder. It's not about talking down to the player, but about teaching them the language of the game. If they're an avid gamer, then many of these symbols will already be part of their visual lexicon. I don't think anyone would accuse explosive barrels of inherently holding your hand, but they're definitely cliché. They're overused and they're lazy, but they're exceptionally effective at communicating a wealth of information with 0 words. You see this color and shape in a video game and you know what to do. You spot an item with this red cross and its purpose is immediately understood. If your character is being hit with something bright purple or green, you know it's poison. Spikes? In my platformer? I probably shouldn't be touching those. So you mean to tell me that this narrow pathway leads into a wide open arena? This is a boss room, isn't it?
Shit.
Bro, how are you surprised? Tropes being tropes is not inherently bad. We've played video games and subconsciously built these associations. Developers can fall back on this mutual understanding to impart knowledge in an indirect and concise manner. For players who aren't as familiar with games, the language being used is still simple enough to where they can easily make the necessary connections. Pointy things hurt. It only makes sense that a large fight necessitates a large open arena.
Are you serious, my brother?
Color is a particularly powerful tool because its associations exist outside of just video games. Red can represent danger or vitality. Purple is an exceedingly rare pigment, making it a solid color to represent something toxic. And bright green is already associated with radiation. It stands to reason then that yellow, a color that's used for guidance all over, would do that job just as well in-game. It's language that everybody will instinctively understand. Several games that don't outright use yellow paint still mark points of interest with a different high contrast color. Ghost of Tsushima gave ledges that you can grab these brownish orange streaks. Sekiro's ledges have white chalky streaks and a greenish tint to them. Mirror's Edge made its guidance an in-universe ability that the protagonist possesses called runner vision, which highlights pathways bright red. You know, it's almost like the color yellow specifically is what people have beef with, and any other color is just perfectly fine. Which, I mean, yeah, it's not exactly easy on the eyes, but that's entirely the point. In the mess of detailed textures and hyper-realistic lighting that is modern games, it's not meant to be easily missable. When that RTX is turned on, you gotta lock in 10 times as hard just to navigate these environments. It's like trying to find a needle in an Asmongold's bedroom. Anybody who thinks that they're somehow above any level of signposting, I promise you.
You're not that guy, pal. Trust me. You're not that guy.
Gamers with a capital G, TM, proposed a trade offer. We stop bitching about signposting if developers make them an optional toggle. Problem solved. Except that, in practice, I really don't see that playing out the way that they expect it to. The entire reason that devs even bother making the environmental cues something diegetic like paint or chalk is because it's something that every single player will encounter. No matter what difficulty or version of the game you're playing on, you're gonna see these markings at all times, so devs needed to feel consistent with the game's art direction. Having something that effectively functions as a "show me the yellow paint" button promotes a design that I find far more egregious than any amount of signposting. The original Final Fantasy VII sure as hell isn't hyper-realistic, but it still has some notoriously hard-to-read environments. Making everything interactable be fully 3D just wasn't possible for the PS1's limited processing power. So aside from the character models and a few other things like save points and chests, everything was part of the pre-rendered backgrounds, which also means that they all kind of blended together and made it difficult to parse which paths you could take. This section in particular was a bitch. Square acknowledged the problem, as in subsequent releases of the game, they added the option to press assist outside of battle to bring up these arrows that show you where you can go. It's far from an elegant approach, and it's clear that this wasn't something that they thought of early in development. In my playthrough, I ended up just leaving the arrows on at all times, because it beats having to constantly press the button every time you enter a new screen. In modern games, the "show me the yellow paint" button manifests as detective mode. That's not what it's called in every game, but you know exactly what I'm talking about. You press a button, everything goes dark, and anything important is reduced to easily noticeable primary colors. Call me crazy, but I'll take marked ladders and cliff faces over every third-person protagonist having some sixth sense that highlights all pertinent information. When there's such a clear divide between gameplay and presentation, there's no real incentive to subtly incorporate these elements into the world. How do we seamlessly communicate to players where they can go? Doesn't matter. If they get frustrated, them niggas will just click L2. This is a real quote from the CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment, John Sony. In essence, Detective Vision creates a button that shifts players between immersion mode with a beautifully detailed world and gameplay mode that removes all the window dressing and shows you the shit that really matters. It's not that more extensive toggles can't be done, but most games just don't call for that. Shadow of the Tomb Raider allows players to tweak several aspects of the game's difficulty. You're given individual combat, exploration, and puzzle difficulty sliders, the latter two of which directly impact the amount of guidance that the game gives you. I think this is a great feature for this type of game and welcome its inclusion in any similar titles, but not every title. Combat, exploration, and puzzle solving are all core to the gameplay of Tomb Raider, so each of these sliders will have a significant impact on how the game is played. There are entire sections where the gameplay objective is to just traverse the environment. Finding where to go is the gameplay. When I mentioned Mirror's Edge earlier, some of you may have been wondering, doesn't that game let you turn off runner vision? And you'd be right. In a game entirely about parkour and navigating city rooftops, a constant red path showing you how to get around would be pretty handholdy. So the game lets you disable it, and oftentimes the highlighted path isn't even the most optimal. So the game leaves more than enough room for players to freely express their mastery over the game's mechanics. A game's core gameplay informs how developers choose to signpost. I'll take this moment to remind everyone that Final Fantasy VII is not a game about climbing a fucking mountain. Moments like these in RPGs occur when the game slows down, in the space between the bits of meaningful gameplay. No one is buying 7 Rebirth for its riveting walk and talk gameplay. I know it, you know it, and Square Enix knows it, so it stands to reason that these gameplay sections are ones where devs would want there to be as little friction as possible. Games like Spider-Man and Breath of the Wild, where climbing is a much more prominent mechanic, solve the issue of letting the player know where they can climb by just letting them climb damn near everywhere. But in FF7, a game that doesn't even have a jump button, the vertical movement is there to give players a little palate cleanser from the primary gameplay and something to do as the story progresses. These are parts where you're just going through the motions. Similarly, identifying breakable boxes in RE4 Remake is not something that leaves room for skill expression. You either know it's breakable or you don't. If you're not sure, you walk up, you hit it, you find out. The game doesn't gain any depth by making what's interactable any less obvious. Capcom wants players to know what's breakable the moment it enters their peripheral vision. The Resident Evil series became more action-oriented over the first several titles, and the same is true for the remakes. You can see a massive change in design decisions when looking at past games which use signposting much more sparingly. In RE2 Remake, the moment you enter the RPD, you're prompted to explore your surroundings, and 3 things grab your attention. The laptop screen behind the reception desk in front of you, the roller door to the right telling you to keep out with the glowing red lever next to it, and the electrical box to your left covered in yellow tape. It's not immediately evident where you need to go, but you have a few points of interest to check out. Items in the game don't jump out at you. They're lit just like everything else around them and only reveal a button prompt when you get close, meaning that you have to carefully look over each room if you want to make sure that you don't miss any resources, which the game already heavily limits your access to. You're always given an objective, but not told exactly where to go, and your map only reveals places you've already been to. Your walk speed is pitiful, and your running is only marginally better. All of these things are in service of the game's survival horror vibe and do a damn good job of constantly making you feel like the odds are stacked against you. The game does throw you a few bones, like giving bosses clear weak points you're incentivized to target. You don't have to, but with how limited your resources are and the lack of health bars, it'd be incredibly frustrating to continuously dump lead into a boss and seemingly make zero progress. These things go largely unchanged in 3 Remake, but ammunition is more plentiful, and there is the very rare breakable crate painted yellow. RE4 says fuck all that. Guns? Got that. Ammo? You'll be drowning in more than you know what to do with. Enemies all have a chance of dropping items, which are impossible to miss because they give off this glowing aura. You're constantly running, kicking, flipping, jumping out of windows. You can parry a chainsaw with a combat knife. Where you're supposed to go is never a mystery because you always have an objective marker on your map. All of these things are true of the original and the remake. Well, except for the chainsaw thing. It's clear that identifying what's interactable isn't something Capcom wants you giving much thought to, if any. Because when you're cosplaying John fucking Wick, these things happen automatically. There's a stark difference between how RE4 uses signposting and how a game like God of War handles puzzle clues. And we can easily see this by considering how each one influences how you approach future situations. When you see something marked yellow, you instantly know what that means because of how you've seen it used before. The remake also added breakable crates containing items to the lake section that weren't there in the original. Logically, crashing your boat into a wooden box doesn't end with you getting free goodies. And in the 2005 game, the only thing in the lake aside from Del Lago were bits of debris that damage you if you hit them. So for newcomers and returning players, everything points to crashing into these crates being a bad idea. But because of the associations we've built around this color, we instantly know that there's an item inside. Meanwhile, when you get to another puzzle in God of War, you're not any better equipped to handle them because last time all the game did was outright give you the answer. It's not about telling you what to do and where to go. It's about making sure you know what you can do and where you can go. Depending on the specific game, certain things should be made more or less obvious. Returnal is a brutally challenging roguelike third-person shooter that's far from anything I would consider handholdy. Yet its final boss is accompanied by these glowing blue orbs that demand your attention. The boss only takes damage when you target its weak points, but its weak points are impossible to hit until you shoot the orbs, which then reveal these glowing red eyeballs on the boss. None of this is subtle, and it's not trying to be. In a game genre where you can't save and lose everything upon death, dying because the boss is seemingly invincible would piss anybody off. The game is far more concerned with testing your ability to prepare for boss fights and execute than it is with how well you can scan the arena looking for gimmicks. It wouldn't have been made any better by obscuring these obvious elements. Not all frustration is equal. As long as I'm enjoying the core gameplay, I'll happily bash my head against a wall trying to beat a single boss for hours. But if the game insists on mandatory platforming when its controls clearly weren't built for it, then that's going to frustrate for all the wrong reasons. FromSoft titles are widely regarded as the gold standard for games that don't do any handholding, despite them having some of the yellowest paint of all in the form of messages left by other players, which sometimes just solve mysteries for you that you otherwise would have struggled with. Yet, I don't see people arguing that messages are a feature that baby the player, nor do I think they should. From the jump, multiplayer is something that's always been core to the Souls games. Covenants, bloodstains, summoning, the idea of helping complete strangers is something that's heavily baked into the gameplay. Series director Hidetaka Miyazaki cites a personal experience of his as the inspiration for the system. These games are incredibly obtuse, but they still work so well because of the community they fostered. No matter how dense or unintuitive an aspect of their game may be, FromSoft knows with absolute certainty that the player base will put their heads together and find an answer in record time. It's one of the many reasons why people say that Souls doesn't need an easy mode. All the tools you need are already there, and it's up to you which ones you interact with. Random messages scribbled all over the map may not help to immerse you in the world, but they go a long way in teaching you how to speak the game's language. Maybe not that one. Signposting is an integral part of video games that isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And like any aspect of game design, it's something that can be done well or done poorly. but when criticizing its implementation, it's important to consider the context in which it's being used. Some games would greatly benefit from an alternate approach. You could not have to mark breakable boxes by just having every box be breakable. Remove climbing from your game altogether and there's no longer a need to mark what's climbable. Adopt an entirely new art style so that everything is easier to see and less overt signposting is needed. That last choice is what Valve ultimately decided to do when playtesting early builds of Portal.
Early versions of Portal featured more detailed, cluttered environments, much like Half-Life 2. We quickly realized that unnecessary objects scattered all over the place distracted players to the point where it actually interfered with the Portal training process. So we simplified the art style to favor clean, focused test chambers.
Playtesting is a major factor in why things get signposted. If someone testing the game fails to notice something that the developer thought was obvious, then that indicates that some kind of revision may be needed. It's easy to think that people playing these games are just idiots, and that I wouldn't get stuck there, so that must mean that they're getting some really stupid people to playtest. Don't get me wrong, there are absolutely some dumbass gamers out there. How do I use third eye? I can't figure it out how it works. Please help me. Press L2.
Thanks.
But devs aren't going out of their way to appeal to the lowest common denominator. If that's what they wanted to do, they'd be working on Fortnite too. Playtesting exists to simulate how people will interact with a game and provides devs with useful information. Valve especially is a company that greatly values playtesting and considers player feedback throughout every step of development. This doesn't mean that playtesters have final say in creative decisions. The result of their tests is ultimately just data to be weighed against other considerations and assist developers in determining the best way to achieve their end goal. It's a problem-solving tool. Sometimes the answer is something as drastic as a change in art direction. In the developer commentary for Half-Life 2, game designer Greg There's no way that's his name, right? There's no way. Damn. Yep, that's going on the list. Game designer Greg Coomer describes how certain elements were removed from the game due to playtesting.
Before we simplified the path through the Guardian's lair, we allowed a right turn at this junction, leading the player right back to where they began. One of our playtesters continued to repeatedly turn right here for half an hour. That was a compelling argument for removing the maze-like elements.
If something is non-essential and creating difficulties, then completely axing it might be the best use of time and resources. If playtesters are outsmarting devs and progressing through a level in a way that they never considered, then they need to be more clever with their presentation. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, and that's exactly why testing is important. Valve exemplifies how vital playtesting is to improving user experience. It's impossible to predict exactly how an end user will approach your virtual world as the one who designed it. But the onus is still on you to teach them the ABCs of how your world operates, and you may have to rebuild some things from the ground up. But sometimes, when you're trying to communicate something so inconsequential in the grand scheme of how the game is played, just paint the damn thing yellow. I promise you, the action RPG is not any more dumbed down because the brief instances of climbing let you know unequivocally where you can grab. The core gameplay, what you actually bought the game for, remains unaffected. But who knows? Maybe the game drops and Sephiroth has bright yellow targets tattooed on each nipple. In that case, I'ma owe y'all an apology. Time will tell. But until then...
Patrick, can you shut the fuck up?